pump. We have a fantastic panel, so I will get right into the introductions. Kate Harbath is the founder and CEO of Anchor Change, as well as a former Facebook public policy director. Josh Lawson is advisor to the Aspen Institute on AI and democracy-related risks, also formerly of Meta. Yoel Roth is a Knight Visiting Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, a Technology Policy Fellow at UC Berkeley, and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he's also former head of Trust and Safety at Twitter. Brandon Tucker is the Senior Political Director of Color of Change, and our moderator today is Richard L. Hasen, Professor of Law and Political Science here at UCLA, and Director of the Safeguarding Democracy Project. I'm very excited for the discussion. Rick, over to you.
Thank you. So I also want to welcome everyone. This is the second of our Safeguarding Democracy Project webinar series. This one is live. I really would like to get students more interested, and I think pre-lunch is a great motivator, which I think that will be at the end, so that's a way to get students in the classroom. But most importantly, we'll do Q&A only with the live audience, so think of your questions. We're going to try and leave the last part of the talk today for discussion. This event, as mentioned, is co-sponsored between the Safeguard Democracy Project and UCLA Lawson Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. Thanks to Michael, and thanks to Lex Matta of ITLP. Also want to thank Harley Ham and Ben Austin DeCampo for their logistical support today. And I just want to tell you about a couple of the programs of the Safeguard Democracy Project. At the end, we'll hear about the upcoming programs for ITLP. All of the events and programs are free, but registration is required at safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. On Thursday, October 12th at noon Pacific, I'm going to discuss the Roberts Court in American Democracy with Joan Biskupic of CNN. She's the author of the new book, 9 Black Robes. On Tuesday, October 17th at 12:15, Genevieve Lockyer and Eugene Volokh will be in conversation with me on the Trump prosecutions, the First Amendment, and election interference. That event will also be live at the law school, free lunch, so show up. Then on November 16th at noon Pacific time, Pam Fessler, formerly of NPR, will be monitoring a great panel covering the risks to elections on the state and local level, producing the reporters. We'll hear from Jonathan Lai, Carrie Levine, Patrick Marley, and Yvonne Winget-Sanchez. Again, events are free, but registration is required. Today's topic is a very important one. How should platforms handle election speech and disinformation in 2024? We have an incredible panel of experts to explore these issues, and you've already heard their introductions. I'm going to ask the four speakers, starting with Katie at the end and then working our way across here. I've got an opening question, and then I'll have a little back and forth, and then I'd like to involve all of you in the room in the discussion. If you're watching online, this event, the Q&A box will not be monitored, so we'll be not taking any questions online. So here's the question I want to ask each of you to take up to 5 minutes to address. What did we learn from how the platforms handled issues of election speech and disinformation in 2020? And do you expect things to be better, worse, or the same in 2024? Katie.
Sure. I just want to thank you for having me here. I'm glad it all worked out. I'm so excited to be on this panel with some of my favorite people. So a little bit more context, just really quickly on my background that I think will be important is part of the work I did at Facebook along with Josh was running Facebook's elections program around the globe, starting in 2013 through the end of 2019. So I would actually kind of ask that the premise of the question, maybe even go back to 2016, what we learned from that to 2020 to what we're going to 2024, because we've really seen phases of all this, right? Like, I think we sometimes forget the first 15 years of tech and democracy, we had a real rosy and optimistic view of the role technology would play in democracy. We thought it would be the great democratizer. You had the Arab Spring, we wanted the President of the United States to be on these platforms engaging with voters. We wanted that. That was like our end goal. We thought that that was going to be a good thing. And then clearly in 2016, starting with May 9th, 2016, which was the day of the Philippines election, and then you had Brexit a month later, and then you had the US November election. We've obviously seen since then the platforms spending, the legacy platforms, which I'm going to put as Facebook, Google, Microsoft, the before Elon times for Twitter. minus the current ones, where we really saw there was a lot of time and effort. This is when the civic integrity teams were built, political ad transparency was put in. You started to see policies directly around elections. We hired people like Josh to like purposely focus on that. And hopefully I'm not taking up too much of your comments. And the peak of that was 2020. The peak of that was 2020, where you had a combination of just, right, so many things happening. These platforms were putting out statements after statement about all the stuff they were doing, not only to protect against foreign interference, but mis and disinformation, how they were helping people to register to vote, know when to vote. They were creating voter information centers. They were doing all of this type of stuff. You also saw platforms taking different approaches. So you had some ban ads. I think Twitter banned political ads in fall of 2019. Facebook, then Facebook and Google still allowed them, but started to make different options available. Since then, we've seen the political situation change in our country, political pressure. We've seen also, there's a great piece by Kate Klonick about sort of, is the age of golden tech accountability gone? And I think a lot of the legacy platforms are sort of like, what are we getting out of this? What are we getting out of this? We're getting all this political pressure. Did we go too far? What does this look like? You then had the layoffs happen. And there's a lot of concern right now about what this might look like as we go into 2024. And I'm really worried because it's the biggest year of elections around the globe. So I know we'll probably talk a lot about the US today, but it's really important to know that it's the first time ever in the history that you're going to have, in the same year as the US presidential election, elections in India, Indonesia, maybe Ukraine, Taiwan, Mexico, the UK, the European Parliament. There's 65 elections across 65 national level elections across 54 countries that I've been tracking. And we can quibble on the numbers and how you count the EU elections. But so that's a lot of fronts for these platforms to cover. We have a lot of newer platforms that for the first time, they are going to be, they're having to build out these tools and resources. TikTok, Discord, Twitch. Substack has said they want 2024 to be known as the Substack election. They're leaning in. And so there's a kaleidoscope of approaches that we're seeing the platforms really take. And you add on top of that all of the stuff around AI and then all of these court cases that are working their way through that I'm sure we'll maybe talk about. That's just adding a lot of uncertainty to this space. It's adding a chilling effect to a lot of this work, both inside the companies and outside the companies. And so I'm going to say what I'm nervous about, and I'm going to end an optimistic note. I am nervous about, that's just a lot of chaos. It's a lot of chaos. That's a lot of different things that could play off of one another. That the only thing I can guarantee to you is that 2025 is going to look very different than what the world looks like today. I just don't know exactly how. On the optimistic side, there are still a lot of people at these platforms doing this work. And we can talk about where the C-suite and others are putting resources and the decisions they're making on the policies and all of that. But I don't think we should forget that there are people that are trying to do this work. They're trying to do it with the resources that they have. And we shouldn't think that this is an all or nothing thing. My implore to everybody is to panic responsibly as we go into all of this, because it's neither all bad and all good. The truth is maybe somewhere in the middle.
Thank you. Josh.
Katie said, I think it's actually great that you set it up that way because you were 13 to 19 and I came into 19.
Yeah.
And was headed through that election in the process up until a couple months ago. It depends on who the we is in your question. What lessons did we learn? I'll take it from the platform side. There's a lot of technical things that we learned through the 2020 election. I'll keep those kind of off the table and focus in on things that I think people would at least assume and understand the leadership to have understood from what the lessons were. Not all of which I agree with, and I hope that it's clear probably from this conversation that these are not monoliths, right? There are people inside these companies who have particular views. But I think that what the C-suite took away from the 2020 election is that, one, removals of content buy you a lot of a headache, but they do little on the actual information ecosystem integrity side. And so you've seen since then a real shift towards what they call recommendations and discovery changes. And this is where your feed, for instance, now on Facebook platform is mostly stuff that they're putting in front of you, not stuff that you're following. But that is the case across TikTok, that's the case across Instagram, it's the case across a lot of these platforms now. So between takedowns and algorithmic options is where they leaned in post 2020. Second piece is the foreign versus domestic interference. I think that it's fair to say that there was at least a political coalition in the United States that would cover efforts in that area to really tackle information operations, especially if they were foreign in origin, around a domestic election. That coalition has eroded quite a bit. And I think that part of the 2020 lesson was that the American public understood what some, at the table, I think, would probably say that they've seen before, which is that the call was coming from inside the House. That while there were foreign efforts to interfere, those were primarily force multipliers and not the force themselves, which has changed the political dynamic for what the platforms think they're allowed to do now. And you see this in court cases, and I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit. Third area, I think, is they have walked away from 2020 election cycles thinking that the sentiment towards big tech has fully hardened. And another way to say that is that the press no longer has carrots to offer, because what warranted further investment, or what us out on the outside, right, would call trying, right, what warranted trying, was the opportunity to prove that you thought that this was important and to be seen investing in these areas, not just whether or not you were successful. It was both. But with hardened sentiment, the kind of odd thing that ends up occurring is that you actually have less incentive to do more, because you think that if you do more, it won't matter to the people that you're trying to influence, whether that's elite opinion or popular opinion. On whether it will be better, I think we'll probably get into the AI challenges and what content changes we might see actually in 2020. I would caution us against thinking of these platforms as at all the same as they were back in 2020. You have a ship of Theseus problem, right? Or a naming fallacy, whichever way you want to kind of package it. If these platforms were the same, I could make a better prediction. They're not the same. Like I said, Facebook has changed completely to like a recommendations-based feed, which means that they're able to serve you up what they want. And then Instagram is short form video. That wasn't the case before. WhatsApp even has channels, hundreds, even thousands of people can be on one thing, which looks a lot like social media, and then Threads. And that's just Meta. I will let X be X, and you will get to talk about this. But I do think that it will be very different, and I'm sure we'll get into the AI conversation, and I can give you my predictions on whether it will be better or worse. Over to you.
Thank you. Go on.
So when I first joined Twitter in 2014, it was really in a moment where the tech industry still had those last glimmers of receiving carrots from the public and from the press. It was a moment of, recognition of the challenges of social media platforms, the ways that abuse could have negative effects on people's experience, but it still felt like there was a bit of that glimmer. There was that sort of optimism about what it could be. And then a lot of things changed. And so I guess the theme I want to tease out a little bit is the swinging pendulum of platform investment. I think we've seen the ways that public advocacy and criticism of platforms can drive investment. That was the big shift after 2016. And I think we're seeing now the pendulum swing in the other direction. And the question is, why is it swinging? And I would argue it's swinging because of exactly those same dynamics of public pressure that prompted the investment in the first place. And so we have a bit of an unsustainable and I would say dangerous dynamic there, where platforms are kind of blowing in the wind. Years ago, Daphne Keller wrote an amazing article that was talking about why Facebook moderates content and what the influences on Facebook are. And what she was arguing was that it's actually problematic that Facebook moderates on demand. That when the public yells at Facebook loudly enough, they take a bunch of stuff down, and Mark Zuckerberg posts a mea culpa about Nipplegate or whatever the scandal du jour is, and that's how moderation works. And she's like, this is hardly a system of governance. But that's how every one of these platforms operate. I remember in 2017, the first meeting that I had with executives at Twitter where they were like, what the hell happened in this election? There was a recognition, and it happened the same way at every company, that we were asleep at the wheel. We had no clue what had been happening, and we needed to figure it out quickly. We needed to figure it out because there were strong coalitions within civil society that were criticizing us. There was bipartisan criticism on the Hill, not just Democrats, but it was a bipartisan security question. And in response to it, platforms invested heavily. I remember in the early days of this work at Twitter, I was a team of one. supporting every election around the entire world. It was just me. And then because of public criticism and sustained outrage and many, many negative press articles and congressional hearings, that changed. And by the time I left Twitter last November, it was a team of more than 200 people doing this work. And I mention that because on one hand, that's great. Like, it sounds like all of the pressure on platforms really drove a meaningful impact, but we're now seeing it swing in the exact opposite direction. And it's not just Elon Musk firing everyone. Like, sure, he did that, but why did he do it? He did it because we took our foot off the gas. We've stopped treating election security like an existential question. We've let it become politicized. We're no longer even occupying a shared reality where we can all agree that Russian interference was a thing that happened in 2016 and that that's bad, right? Russiagate is now treated as a conspiracy. It's a partisan question. We've lost sight of the fact that protecting the security of elections around the world is not a political question, it is a democratic one. And the result of that has been that platforms have more latitude to reduce their investments in this space. And as Josh said, they have fewer incentives to keep up their investments. And so what am I worried about? I'm worried about the fact that in 2024, platforms will have fewer resources in place than they did in 2022 or in 2018. And that what we're going to see is platforms again asleep at the wheel. The good news is that even if that happens, I think the pendulum will swing right back the other way. There will be a cycle of public outrage, there will be congressional hearings, there will be changes. Mark Zuckerberg will post a mea culpa on his wall on Facebook, and that will be that. I worry that it will come after the damage has been done in the United States and in 60 other countries. So that's perhaps not the most uplifting message, but I look at it over sort of the long arc of time. I was at Twitter for nearly 8 years. I've seen this pendulum swing. I worry we're headed towards the less positive end of the spectrum at the moment.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I come to this conversation from a much different background, where I spent years actually working to elect people, and then almost a decade in the labor space and with the ACLU, and now with Color of Change. And thinking about 2020 and my focus and concern often with voter suppression, voter intimidation, misinformation being spread pretty widely and no real algorithmic accountability or transparency, and then the disinformation clearly having real implications that we saw, that we can see during the election and thereafter the election. And so I think when we have the discussion about 2020, I think we can take away that platforms that act too slowly has an impact. Platforms that apply warning labels that allow room for ambiguity has an impact. And I think platforms that don't flat out call a lie if somebody says before the election is even over that I won, and then the warning label is that this isn't for certain, or the whatever official results are not in yet. You have to be full-throated. And so I think as we've seen some of the disinformation intentionally put out there by powers that be, and also I'll say quickly that being one at the ACLU for as long as I did, I think there is a conflation of speech on social media platforms being the same as speech in the world, and my voice being equivalent to that with somebody of 80 million followers, or that somebody who actually governs the state. And it's just not the case. My 2 retweets and my 1 heart aren't impacting or potentially causing an insurrection. And so, all things considered, what we took away from 2020 is that there were real flaws. And granted, I know these conversations inside the companies are really, really difficult, like some real things to wrestle with, especially principally. How do we say, you can't say this, but they can? How can I remove this post, but leave this one? And there is a gray area, and I concede that. But there are real world implications that start with either what someone's followers are willing to do if they say we've been cheated, what laws may actually come into place if they say there are 2+ million votes that have been found. That's going to create a ripple effect and voter suppression in states where they don't want access to the ballot box easily. And so these things just need to be considered. And so when we think about 2024, you know, my fellow panelists can speak to it more than I can, but with regards to what I can simply read is that the personnel is not there. And I think there's a few things that you need to actually be on top of disinformation, especially going into 2024, and why I feel not as optimistic. One, I think the platform has to care. Two, you need the personnel and the contractors and the fact checkers to be working rigorously. And three, I think there needs to be acknowledgement that with real power and comes a real responsibility. And I don't know if those two things drive either. They can speak better to that better than I can either, or additionally. So, you know, I don't feel exactly stoked for 2024. But you know, will it lead to what it led to in 2020? I'm not exactly certain.
All right, well, I wouldn't say you've all cheered me up to start, but a lot of food for thought. Let me come to Yoel. You had an article, an op-ed in the New York Times on Sunday, and you discussed, I urge all of you to read it. You discussed personal threats that you and your family have faced in the wake of attacks on you for your content moderation, and more broadly, a whole community of scholars around the country who in 2020 were working on, in real time, identifying election disinformation and trying to explain how it was working and provide that information to the platforms. And now those people who were involved in those activities, they're subject not only to threats, but they're also being subject to congressional investigation and some lawsuits. And both Josh and Katie referenced lawsuits. And so I'm wondering, starting with you, Yoel, even if people at platforms who are making these decisions want to do the right thing, ideally, how much is political pressure going to be a factor in, for example, if Donald Trump is back on X or wherever, and he is saying that the next election is going to be stolen, or that there's fraud at the ballot box, the question of whether that stuff gets boosted or not, how is all this going to work out in this very different political atmosphere that we had in the run-up to 2020?
I mean, my argument is that it is dispositive in a lot of these situations of how platforms will respond. I take the criticism very much that Twitter's labels in 2020 on misinformation were a little, how do we put it, bland, overly lawyered, cautious. They were. And the next question for me, the thing that animated me to write that op-ed in the New York Times is why? Why were they like that? And the reason that they were like that was because the very first time that Twitter applied a fact-checking label to Donald Trump, the retaliation was my face on the cover of the New York Post. The retaliation was Donald Trump calling me a hater on Twitter. The retaliation was months of threats against me and my family. And I bring this up not, to elicit sympathy, although I'll always take it. Like, boo-hoo, that was like, it sucked. I don't recommend being on the cover of the New York Post if you can avoid it. But I mention this because that's actually a really effective way to target one of the few vulnerable parts of multi-billion-dollar companies, their employees. Companies like Meta, Twitter, back before it, lost 75% of its value, these companies were in a lot of ways too big to regulate. Too powerful, too invulnerable. They can gesture at regulatory compliance without really needing to do anything. But the vulnerable point has always been their employees. In 2016, a Facebook employee in Brazil was put in preventive prison, which is a wonderful euphemism, because Facebook didn't turn over data that the company simply didn't have. A judge overturned that order the next day, but we've always seen that individual people become the targets of pressure campaigns to influence corporate behavior. And I believe that is what happened in 2020 with Twitter. I experienced that targeting directly, and Twitter then didn't entirely back away from being as aggressive as we wanted to be, but certainly were a bit more cautious of what the consequences could be. That's not an accident, it's a strategy. It's a strategy because it unfolded less than 24 hours after Twitter's first fact check. How did anybody have time to orchestrate this campaign if it hadn't already been planned as a strategic response? This is what companies are up against. And so when we see companies fail, and they all fail in different ways, I'm really interested in what the causes of those failures are. And I think the strategic intimidation of staff is a really substantial contributor to it.
Thanks for that. I don't know if either.
Can I just add one little piece
Yes,
to it?
go ahead.
And this is a playbook that is not just happening in the United States. So there are physical presence laws that didn't exist before 2020 abroad that are now in existence because other governments, mostly authoritarian ones, understand that they need a hook. And a great hook is the personnel of some of these major platforms. And so they know that that factors into the strategy that the platforms take. It is an asymmetric way to get at the decision-making process of people that are otherwise out of reach. And it's something that we saw in the United States with you as kind of the biggest example of that, but it is also something that we're seeing abroad. This is a tactic.
And if I can do, politics is, we can all, in our utopia, we could not want political pressure to play a role in all of this, but the reality is that it does. And I think we can also talk about different structures internally at these platforms that can help to mitigate that. Twitter had a different structure than what Meta did. I think at the end of the day, as long as your senior execs are swayed by the political pressure, the internal structure of it can sometimes matter a little bit less. But I think that as we're having this conversation, particularly when you zoom out to the global lens, there are many times where people want the governments to hold tech companies accountable. But then there's times where the government makes a request and they want the tech companies to hold the governments accountable. And I think we're in the middle. We need to find the right set. And I think the conversation needs to be is how do we build in these checks and balances, not just between tech companies and government, but how you pull in civil society and media and others in academia to help think about how we balance those out, because it's not, none of us want any one of those entities to be making those decisions about what this should look like, and everyone's going to have different levers that they're going to need to pull because not every situation is going to be exactly the same.
I want to come to Brandon and then to Josh about your past experiences. Brandon at the ACLU and Josh, former head of elections at the North Carolina State Board of Elections, which is where I got to know you. So first to you, Brandon, where is that First Amendment line? Assuming that, and this is a question that the Supreme Court may end up addressing this year, assuming that platforms are private.
You are on the dais. So what is your ruling?
Figure out free speech on social media.
So where is the line? Just to give two examples. One, there was a guy named Doug Mackey who in 2016 was a Trump supporter. He sent messages aimed at African Americans, trying to tell them to vote by text or social media hashtag, and about 5,000 people did it. And then he was prosecuted for violating the Ku Klux Klan Act, and now it's up on appeal, and he's raising a First Amendment concern. So that's one example, someone lying about when, where, how people vote. And then there's the example of Donald Trump, who made statements about the election being stolen, but he didn't say anything that was defamatory. There was no way to take legal action directly against him for the statements the way that Mackey did, I think, at least until the insurrection. How do you decide where the line is? What would you advise Meta or any of these other companies if they are trying to figure out how to do the right thing in 2024?
Well, clearly I'm going to not be definitive or very specific here. But I think something that we can potentially agree upon is the size of the contributor or the creator or the author of the tweets. There has to be levels to where the policies aren't so specific that they have and again, don't know the inner workings, have staff scrubbing anywhere between 1 follower and 90 million followers. I believe Twitter had potentially staff focusing solely on Donald Trump. I may have that wrong. But the scope and size, I think, matters. This is not a free speech for me, not for thee type of thing. And this is not where all speech is equal, where we're back in the cafe and we can both argue our points. If we were in a stadium right now and y'all did not have a microphone and I did, I win the debate. And that's potentially or effectively what's happening on social media, being inundated without real safeguards around what's being promoted, what's being liked, what's being retweeted before that fact check comes in, and then all of a sudden it's gospel. And so, you know, it's very difficult lines. Of course, we have our, you know, true threats and fighting words and defamation and you know, words that contribute to crimes, but it's just different in the social space. And I don't, you know, this is going to be figured out by somebody much smarter than me. But I do think that, again, with that level of power, there has to be an additional layer of responsibility that may not be equal to all users, but necessary for the public good. And then, you know, lastly, and I don't want to take anything away from your experience, but I just want to elevate, though, the harms perpetuated and enacted by the real world implications that disinformation and tampering with social platforms has had on people of color, on women, on the LGBT community. These things aren't fake. And so, you know, I don't know you all's politics, but I know my politics, and I feel as if there were huge ramifications for my community and people I ally myself with because of not full-throated denouncement, false pushback on what was clear and blatant disinformation. And that's not to take or minimize your experience, and I don't want it to come off that way, but I want to say that there's also real world impact and harm perpetuated for decisions or lack thereof on communities that I align with as well.
All right, so I want to go to Josh, and then I have a question for Katie about AI, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you. So Josh, you thought about election integrity before you thought about content moderation. And I want you to talk about how these things interact. One of the things, there was a report issued today by Issue One organization about the huge attrition rate election workers are leaving because they're facing threats too. That is a double whammy because you lose that experience, and that can undermine people's confidence if inexperienced people are running elections, and you maybe have people coming in who have misconceptions about how elections are supposed to be run. So like there are definitely real world implications of all this, and I'm wondering what you think responsible social media should look like. One of the criticisms in 2020 was that there was too much content moderation. The Hunter Biden laptop example where there was demotion of the New York Post stories about Hunter Biden's laptop that shouldn't have been, and there was like an overcorrection. Like where, and this is a variation on the question to Brandon, but where is the right line to preserve election integrity, but also to assure that we have robust political speech in a, you know, in a highly charged, polarized society that we're living in right now?
Another easy question. Yeah.
I told you it was going to be a panel of softballs.
No, that's right.
Silver bullet, come on.
That's right. Yeah, so what Rick was kind of referencing, so prior to ever going to Meta, I had been an election lawyer for a really long time. And I led the legal division as the general counsel in North Carolina, which has had substantial democracy problems, especially during the time that I was there during those 5 years. For me, content moderation was a process of shifting to going upstream of the problem, because I was seeing this happen in real time, where misinformation was actually inspiring real world outcomes. Even at that state level, we ended up having the first congressional election in at least 100 years that was overturned because of fraud that our office led an investigation into. And we had a lot of that happening, and seeing that There was not going to be a grown-up in the room that walked in as a regulator and said, here's how it's going to go. This was going to be a decision of the platforms. Because in the United States, for reasons that I think are absolutely correct, and I have a US lawyer trained kind of love for the First Amendment. But the reality is that unless you're talking about really bare minimum statutes, so in North Carolina, we have what Professor Hasen has suggested at the federal level, which is we outlaw misinformation that is materially about whether or not you can vote and what's required to vote. We have that as a state law. And there are real ramifications, but the reality of people's experience, either going to the polls or deciding that it's not worth their time to go vote, et cetera, almost always falls outside of that really narrow band. It's in the memification. Why Democrats or Republicans? They don't represent your interests. Don't take the time to vote. So you stay home. Is that misinformation or disinformation? Question mark. And those are the gray area questions that I think the responsibility does have to be on the platforms to understand that their impact is something that is not tied to a history that is able to really kind of go back and say, well, we did it this way back in the 60s and then we changed it and we did it this way in the 70s and we can have a comparison. No, these are scales and reach that is not precedented, right? And the democratization of these platforms and powers were things that were mediated by lots of institutions in the past, everywhere. And so if the answer really is in the social media space, then you have to say, okay, well, what's going to be your driving, motivating value system? And I think it is incumbent, it is very much to the advantage of the United States and kind of our history and traditions here, that they are nested in the United States. These platforms are here. And we have these values and we believe that these values are really important and they should manifest differently in different places perhaps. There are places where Facebook's platform literally is the internet. 98% of the Philippines use it every day. It is a very much different place than here where there are lots of channels for people to spread any of their political views. And I think that the harm scenario is much less here if you wanted to say, hey, look, speech and reach are two different things, and we're going to reduce your reach substantially whenever you are spreading things that not just kind of violate any particular statute, which we have almost none of in the United States on this area, but that violate our norms, and those norms can be bipartisan, but in support of democracy, as you all say. So it doesn't give you like a clear roadmap, but I think that ultimately we are not going to be able to look to regulators to spell out for us a clear path forward. It's going to have to be a mix of civil society, press pressure, and getting to the C-suite people who have their own value systems and influencing the formation of those values.
So we've talked about different kinds of change. We've talked about the political change that's happened over the last few years that affects content moderation decisions around elections. And we've talked about a little bit about legal changes, and I think that's a big question mark. That right now there's this case, Missouri versus Biden, about whether the government is coercing when it tries to influence content moderation decisions. And then we've got, which we talked about the least of our technical change. AI is going to be, and other technical changes, going to make it much easier technically to spread, a video of, Trump saying something that is incendiary, or Joe Biden tripping down the stairs, all of it, manufactured by a computer. And so, Katie, I'm hoping you can kind of talk about those three different areas and how they interact with each other in the sense of, what's keeping you up at night, I guess is the question. The big picture, and focused on, I know you're talking about the world, but let's focus on the United States for 2024. Where should we be going in the next 6 months with, what's your advice?
So I think I have advice for kind of all those different categories of actors, if you will. And they're all sort of a Venn diagram, right? Like one of the things that actually gave me a lot of hope last year was when the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine did not give me hope, don't get me wrong. But what we did see, though, was that rather than having the government in their corner, the tech companies in their corner, civil society in their corner, all pointing at one another saying, you should do something, you should do something, you should do something, everybody was kind of pulling the levers that they had. Now, we can have the argument about whether or not they pulled the right levers, what those impacts were, et cetera, but it was something where they were all kind of taking the actions that they could in which to do this. And that's something that I would like to see as we continue to move forward in this. Tech companies, they can just move faster. the self-regulation and the voluntary steps that they can take, whether they are legacy companies or newer companies, they are just going to be able to move the fastest. And there's a responsibility they have in which to do that. And we should also expect that their policies and their approach to this, they're going to be living and breathing things. They are going to change and adapt over the next 15 months, depending upon what is happening in the US, what is happening with the law, what is happening in the politics. Again, we may not like that, but it's just kind of the fact of the matter of the situation that we're going to see. And we saw that in 2020, right? In terms of some of these policies needing to adapt and everything, because we could sit there and try to think of every scenario under the sun that might happen. And many times we did through red teaming exercises and stuff like that, but you're never going to be able to exactly prepare for what happens. So there's the role for the tech companies on that. On top of that, as you mentioned with AI, so you have both new technologies that are happening and these newer platforms. Not every platform is the same. So we first should not expect that all of these platforms are going to be able to flip the switch and have all the same tools and everything ready that the companies that have been working on this since 2016 can have. Two, one of the organizations I'm a part of is the Integrity Institute, and we've been putting out election practices, best practices guide on election integrity programs for platforms and trust and safety employees. And one of the things we heard loud and clear, we have over 300 members that either used to work at or currently work at tech companies on this stuff, was that please don't be too prescriptive because every platform is different, our risk tolerance is different, and a whole bunch of other things are different. So instead we gave frameworks to them for how they can think about this. And that includes the AI companies as well. AI companies, they're hiring people for elections. They're thinking through these problems. And if this was, Josh can speak to this much better than I can, but if these were easy questions to answer, the policies would be out there right away, but they're not easy. Like, we want this to be a thoughtful process, and they are bringing in outside voices and other things to think about this. Unfortunately, we can't hit the pause button on elections to give them that time to do that, and the genie's out of the bottle. So we're gonna be building the plane as we go. On the government side, yes, there's not much happening on the federal level. We'll have a bunch of hearings. I think Bruce Melman put out his quarterly report this week. He's a political science strategist in DC, where there's been, I think, like 25, 27 hearings on AI this year, and like years previous is only like 7 that have happened. So there'll be a lot of discussion on it. That will have an impact on what companies do, but I don't suspect we'll see legislation in the US. However, Europe, the Digital Services Act is being implemented. We're seeing regulation in other places that will impact what is happening here in the US, and government will play a role. The FEC is currently accepting public comments on potential rulemaking for AI use in political ads that could have an impact on this. So government has its role. Civil society, media, academia, continuing to put pressure to get more data, more transparency, asking the platforms what they're doing. Trust me, the platforms are doing stuff even if they're not ready to talk about it yet, as much as that may have annoyed all of us when we were inside and we want to be like, just wait, we know you want to hear from us. But there's a role that civil society does play that needs to be asking those questions. And I know you wanted to keep me in the US, but just they should be asking it in other places as well. Because what happens in those places might be used in the United States. So I don't think we can think about all these elections in silos. So that's kind of how I'm looking at this, like over the next 6 months. I don't want this to anybody being like, oh, we need to wait for them to do this, or them to do this, or them to do this. And I think there's all small steps that we can keep taking forward every single day to try to continue to show momentum on this work, even if it seems like a really daunting mountain, and it is that we're like embarking on climbing.
I don't know if any of you want to make any additional comments, or I'll open it up to the audience. No? Great. So raise your hands. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you.
And if you don't mind, just speak up so that they can hear you online as well.
I usually have a problem with that. So my name's Adar. Thank you for speaking with us today. Sharing your thoughts. Let's talk about products. With the advent of artificial intelligence, why not implement some sort of like feature, like the like button, but instead where it's a possibility, or the likelihood of being true or false, where you have a large language processor or a large language machine read the or review the post, in that fashion. Generally for all participants on any platform, have their posts rated. And in that way would circumvent the CCT, the content moderation, section 230, and you wouldn't even have any issues with freedom of speech, given that people would still be able to post their thoughts. That's my question.
Can AI solve the truth and falsity problem?
You want to go first?
I can try taking that one. No, look, that's the dream, right? I think every platform that had to wrestle with the question of moderating misinformation would love to automate it in some way. And the dream of generative AI is that it can be conversational, it can do it at scale, it can learn. There's a few roadblocks. First is the large language models that exist right now have a tendency to hallucinate a little bit, which, especially in the context of debunking misinformation, can be particularly damaging because it can create implied truth effects if things are labeled inaccurately, and then you start to believe things that are actually untrue because they're labeled the wrong way. So there's some pretty significant challenges just with the present state of the technology. The more fundamental challenge, and there's been a lot of research from folks both within the large AI companies and outside of it. Timnit Gebru, who is formerly a researcher at Google, has talked about large language models as stochastic parrots, which is this like wonderfully evocative phrase, like AI as just sort of taking a bag of words, shaking it up a little bit, and then regurgitating something seemingly at random in a way that it thinks will please its audience. And when you think of something like misinformation, that's particularly challenging because what you need is not a stochastic parrot. You need technology or people that are willing to challenge prior held beliefs and speak truth to falsehoods. And that's not what we see language models doing very effectively. Could this change? Absolutely. Could the technology continue to mature? Sure. But I think in its current state, the way that we've seen the technology be implemented, we found that generally AI-based fact-checking is not sort of able to perform as well as human-based fact-checking, and there's some very potentially serious backlash effects that can happen as a result of misapplication. So again, perhaps not uplifting, but my hope is that in the future we'll see something like that emerge as a viable solution.
Yeah, it does raise a question if there's a demand for misinformation and disinformation, then that upsets this idea that it's a variation on the marketplace of ideas that the truth is going to emerge. You can imagine concerted efforts to try to game the system, rating something that's false as true. Yeah.
Can I ask a couple of questions on the transparency trade-offs? Because on the one hand, you mentioned everybody likes to talk about how we need more transparency, and transparency is fundamental to the system. But you also talked about a trend of moving from taking content down to questions around algorithmic amplification, right? And you mentioned that one of the benefits of that is it attracts less controversy and less heat. The reason for that is because it's much less transparent and it's much more difficult to spot. And similar to what you mentioned about in terms of your own experiences, there's also, I think, a tension between a drive to want to put a face and a name to these decisions, which I think is also fundamental to accountability, and a desire to protect the people that are making these decisions from intimidation. Right? I think that there's an argument to be made that if you have this incredibly influential position and you're responsible for decision making on a platform like that you should be, I don't want to say a household name, but you should be somebody who's prominent. That doesn't mean you should be threatened, obviously, but there's a similar tension there between a need to identify the people where the buck stops and potential negative consequences that can attract that. They need to do the process more effectively, which can sometimes require that you not disclose as much. So I guess how should platforms be navigating that? Is it something that can be reasonably navigated within the platforms, or is that just an area where governments need to draw a line and say, here's what you're disclosing and here's what you're not?
Maybe you heard two questions in there. One's around legitimacy, one's about kind of accountability. You want to take the second one? I can take the first if that. Okay, let's do it this way. So we're in law school. How many people in here, by show of hands, believe that the Dobbs decision overturning Roe last year was legitimate? Okay, so for like the folks on Zoom, it's like nobody. This is a 234-page opinion with concurrences and dissents. These are written by individuals who are known, to your point, kind of on a first name basis, literally at kitchen tables around the country. They were appointed by duly sworn presidents and confirmed by the most deliberative body in the world. Does that make for legitimacy? And I think that there's a real question that we should ask ourselves. All of the procedural legitimacy, are we doing it because it's the right thing to do? Because you should have accountability and you should have transparency and you should make sure that there are notice and reasonable opportunities to contest decisions that are reached arbitrarily. Or are we doing it because we think that it's a way to shape elite opinion? And if it's this bad at shaping elite opinion, then I don't know that that's the way that we should be putting all of our chips in the more processed bucket. I think you should have the ability to defend and hold up to scrutiny the decisions that you make, but whether or not there is a 234-page opinion, and whether that ends up being relevant or not at all relevant to a takedown decision or an algorithmic decision, I just don't know that that's the tree that we should all be barking up. I think that we might have a more productive conversation if we move on from some of the procedural legitimacy pieces. Still do it, absolutely, because it's the right thing to do, but don't do it because you think it's going to shape elite opinion.
Anyone else?
Let me do a quick straw poll in the room. Today, a number of platforms released their latest reports under the EU Disinformation Code of Practice. Show of hands, how many of you have ever read an EU Disinformation Code of Practice platform report? All right, I'll ask
The record show there were two.
Yeah. Let me ask maybe a broader one. How many of you have ever read a transparency report from a major tech platform like Twitter or Facebook? Slightly more hands, we're at like 5. I say all of this because I think the existing transparency and accountability regimes from every major platform, including the ones that are being pushed by the savviest regulators in Brussels, have failed and suck. And the reason that I believe that they have failed and suck is because not only are they ineffective at influencing elite audiences, but they are even less effective at influencing the billions of people using social media platforms. And so where do we go from here? I think it would be a failure condition to treat accountability and transparency as just being about this sort of transactional data. Like Facebook took down 9 billion posts of blog. It's decontextualized, it's nonsense. Nobody can make heads or tails of that data. I'm working on a paper right now that's sort of thinking about a 4-part taxonomy of what meaningful transparency could be. Transactional data is step 1. Step 2 is comparative data. If you're deciding, do I want to use Instagram or do I want to use TikTok or do I want to use Threads or X, I guess that's a thing, like you need to be able to compare these platforms. You need to understand you can't do that with any of the data that's out there right now. It is not possible. So we need comparative data. Third, we need data about the coercive influences on platforms, right? The premise of the Fifth Circuit ruling in Missouri v. Biden, a lot of the Twitter files, God help us, a lot of that is sort of exploring who was trying to shape the decisions that platforms were making. Who were they getting emails from? What did those emails say? What did they do in response to them? Was it the FBI? Was it Color of Change? All of those are coercive influences on platforms. We should understand them, and there should be transparency and accountability related to them. And then fourth and finally, we need to think about, alluding to what Katie said, the organizational structures of platforms. How are these companies set up, and what incentives or disincentives to action does that create? Currently, we're doing one of those, and we're doing it badly. And so I think there's a massive gulf between what actual accountability for tech platform decisions could be and where we are today. And regrettably, I actually don't see regulation presently moving us in the direction of that. We're seeing these like herky-jerky attempts to do it with like the Twitter files, but none of that is quite getting at what could actually shift some of these dynamics in the real world.
I want to ask Brandon and Katie to follow up on this point, and then I think we're going to have to close because we're running out of time. Is there a role for government regulation of election-related content in the United States on election-related content on the platform? Brandon? So Brandon and Katie, give me the last word.
I think absolutely. I would be curious on the North Carolina statute. I would have to read it. It almost came off as too much, too harsh. But I think there is a sweet spot that we can codify with regards to protecting individuals who are apt to voter suppression tactics and who are susceptible and soft targets for misinformation and disinformation. I think the through line should be a support for easy access to the ballot. I think the through line should be ample information and easy access to good information and factual information. And I think that muddying the waters has real life consequences. We're playing on the margins here. Georgia was over 12,000 votes. And so out of millions of voters, we don't have room to tamper or to not be direct and absolute in our defense for access to the ballot box. And I think there's a sweet spot. I admittedly am not an advocate for increasing incarceration rates. So, criminal penalties for intentional or unintentional misinformation or disinformation online. I would have to sit with that for a second. But again, it goes to the reach versus speech conversation. But, I think we can find a sweet spot to protect access and increase access to the ballot box.
Katie, 2 minutes.
Yeah.
US regulation.
I have a really hard time seeing how any law that's content-based is gonna hold up to the First Amendment. Now, the Supreme Court might surprise me. I don't want to, on all of that, I really struggle with seeing any of that being upheld, but that doesn't mean there isn't a role for government regulation. There's other levers in which to look at potentially, and I say this not as a lawyer, I do not have a law degree or anything, I just play one on TV, whether it is around like the behavior of those actors, who those actors are, the design of these platforms, something Josh kind of alluded to, and I think is somewhat at the core of a lot of our uneasiness about this, is at the end of the day, we are beholden to some benevolent CEOs and whether or not they're benevolent or not in the decisions that they make. And there's we don't feel that there's accountability. We don't feel like there's an appeals process. We don't feel like there's much that we can do depending upon what they say. And again, that can be that role going back to what I was saying around setting up some of those checks and balances of what this looks like. Because I do think there is a role that oversight can play on this. And I think there's legitimate questions to be had. Now, I think we need to be really careful. Michael, right? Sorry. Your question around putting a name to the decision and the treatment of that, you all knows better than anyone, but that's something, that's a real risk. And I'm not only worried about that for election officials, but I'm worried about that for trust and safety people. And are people gonna wanna go into this work when they're watching Yoel in a congressional hearing get yelled at by members of Congress? And that scares a lot of people, and that concerns me a lot. And so there could be protections for employees put into place. There's been some in California and others that I know Ifiozima and others have put into place around thinking about this. So I guess my call to action, or what I would implore all of us to do, is maybe also think a little bit outside the box of other angles that we could be thinking about this, of where regulation might work, and not just think about it from a content perspective.
Use the last 30 seconds that she said.
Please.
Okay, last time I was in this room was 20 years ago, and I was sitting there watching a panel literally right here say that one day, if we try really hard, we might have marriage equality in the United States. And a year after that, the president was reelected popularly on the promise that he was going to change the Constitution to make sure that didn't happen. 4 years after that, we ended up having a majority in this state say, no, gay marriage, we're gonna amend the Constitution. 7 years after that, it's the law of the land, and today it's 71%. So power can change and people can change. I know I did, and I think the platforms can too. So just to kind of echo what you're saying, if we try really hard.
Well, now we have to stop because there was a slightly optimistic note there, so. Thank you, Katie, Josh, Brandon, and Michael's going to announce some of the ITLT upcoming events.
Yeah, please join us October 11th for War Crimes Investigations and Stored Communications Act with Rebecca Hamilton. And join us for Tech Careers Week, October 16th to 20th. We have speakers from not only law firms, but also Apple, the FCC, the Copyright Office, the CIA, a bunch of different career options. So please sign up for that and join us. And thanks again to our great panel.
Thank you for coming.